Some of the most interesting stories in disruption and in cultural movements are when there's a convergence of different elements. Sometimes just the timing works out, where things come together, right people, right idea, right time. And this is one of those stories. Today we're in Berkeley, California, at the famous 924 Gilman Street. This really was the epicenter of the Bay Area punk rock movement in the 1980s and beyond. Welcome to the Ground Floor Innovation Channel. Now, for those of you not familiar with the punk rock scene, 924 really was the epicenter of 1980s punk rock. And the way that that happened is kind of an interesting story. But let's rewind a bit. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, punk rock was really the pendulum swinging in the complete opposite direction of what had come before. And what I mean by that is disco had been a big thing, prog rock had been a big thing, and these were very polished, very commercial genres that were not accessible to everyday people. I mean, you could buy the record, certainly everyone could. You could watch the movies, Saturday Night Fever, all of that. But if you wanted to get involved, there was zero DIY element to that. When punk rock came around, it really challenged that whole construct. Punk rock basically was egalitarian in nature. It opened it up to anyone. You didn't need fancy record labels. You didn't necessarily even need to be good at playing your instrument. You just needed to have the energy and a message, and you could find acceptance within that scene. And so as punk rock was beginning to really take over America, what ended up happening was parallel to that, there was another movement. And that was a youth movement around skate and surf culture. So you had a lot of kids who were middle school age, maybe high school age, that were beginning to build their entire social existence, in particular on the West Coast, around either riding the waves or riding the asphalt. As it happens, these two things came together. And they came together courtesy of magazines like Thrasher that every skateboard kid would have read, where oftentimes the skateboard gear that they were buying, whether it was decks or wheels or trucks, was being bundled with maybe a 7-inch punk rock record. This was a symbiotic relationship where bands were able to promote their music, and at the same time, kids were able to discover music relatively inexpensively for skateboard gear that they were already buying anyway. The same thing, by the way, was happening at surf shops across the West Coast. And so you had a lot of kids who were beginning to find in their adolescent years their voice and their form of expression. Now, the way this typically played out was they would skate or surf by day, and then they would look for gathering spots at night, generally to socialize, and that's where the music element kicked in. But here's the problem. The problem is that for punk rock, in particular because it's so skewed towards youth, the venues just were not set up to accommodate that. And what I mean by that is, the way they made their money was through alcohol sales, meaning that to get in, you had to be 21 and over. That was one challenge. The other challenge was a lot of these venues charged the opening acts for a pay-to-play basis. Basically, they needed to assure that they were bringing in a certain amount of ticket sales in order to even be put on the bill. So both from the band's perspective and from the audience perspective, playing in traditional club and bar environments just wasn't working out. Now, in other parts of the country, most notably in Washington, D.C., there was a workaround for this. There you had bands like Minor Threat and Fugazi that were championing something called the straightedge scene. And this was a variant of hardcore punk rock, the premise of which: don't drink, don't smoke, don't do drugs, don't have promiscuous sex, basically living a clean life. And what they were able to do is they were able to marshal that identity through actually a visual form of expression. And this was taking literally a black Sharpie and drawing big black X's on the tops of their hands. And then this would then alert the venue owners that, hey, I'm here for the punk rock show. I'm underage. I'm not going to drink alcohol. I'm not going to attempt to buy alcohol. And this was kind of their workaround. It was imperfect though, because obviously the system could still be gamed, but it gave at least some of the venues enough confidence where they could book punk rock acts. Now here in Berkeley, there was another solution at play. And it was discovered by a guy by the name of Tim Yohannan, who ran a record label and radio show called Maximum Rock and Roll. This label was geared towards the emerging punk rock scene that was establishing here on the West Coast. And he thought to himself, wouldn't it be great if we had a venue that was run as a collective, where kids could come, they could check out shows, they could even volunteer their time to host the shows, to set up the equipment, and it would be a safe place for them. It would be a place where they didn't have to worry about bullying. It was a place where they didn't need to worry about getting hassled or kicked out. And so he embarked on a journey in 1984 to find a place that could do that. Come to find out, it was exactly this location, 924 Gilman Street, which is kind of an industrial part of town just off of the 80 freeway. He was able to sign a lease, hosted the first show here actually on New Year's Eve of 1986. And the idea was that he would be able to have all of these emerging bands play shows here, have the kids show up, because it is kind of an industrial part of town. Noise wouldn't be bothering anyone. There weren't concerns about this being at odds at all with the community that was in. And it gave kids a sense of having a place that they could call their own. In a traditional concert venue, you bought your ticket, you're in front of the stage, the band comes in from behind a curtain, and that's sort of a wall between yourself and the performer. That was not the case here. This is an unusual venue. The level of energy and the level of participation was also different. You would see the equipment being dragged in. You would see as one band's equipment was torn down, another band's equipment came in. There was a show that I was at where the guitar player broke the strings on his guitar. Another band immediately handed him a guitar to play with so that he could finish his set. So that level of interaction was blurring the wall between audience and performer. And in some ways, that's an intimidating experience when you're very young, because it's like, wow, I'm really in this. This isn't a performance that's being put on for me. I'm actually part of this environment. In fact, maybe the band that I came to see is actually standing right next to me, waiting for their turn to come on stage. They're not in a VIP room. And I think that's something that was an alien concept, because so much of what we're used to being served was being served to us as a defined experience that has a defined beginning, a defined middle, and a defined end. And it's all about how much money separates between my pocket and their pockets between the beginning of the show and the end of the show. Take all of that out, because Gilman Street really wasn't about that. And there's a rawness there, and there's a level of connection there that feels different when you're at a show here versus anywhere else. Along with the sense of belonging and the sense of being a stakeholder, there was also the sense of that this is a place that was a constructive and a supportive environment for a lot of people that might have challenges outside of here. And what I mean by that is, today we have diagnoses of attention deficit or different learning challenges that kids have in school, the frustration, the pressure to excel academically, in particular as we're talking about middle school and high school age kids, expectations around how to spend their social time, and that's a lot of pressure. And for these kids to have an outlet where they could vent, where they could be themselves, where they would not be judged, and they could do it in a place where they weren't getting into trouble, it wasn't antisocial, their parents knew it was a contained environment, they could be dropped off and picked up before curfew. That's not something that was afforded in a traditional nightclub scenario. This really was an area sort of for the artists, by the artists and their fans, and that was the primary driver. The environment was, in fact, the experience. There's something really raw and visceral about places like Gilman. Yes, you're ultimately coming for an experience. You're coming for the band. Maybe it's something that you got a demo tape handed to you from a friend. And that was very commonplace, was people would build mixtapes for each other. That's how you discovered music. You hear a song and you're like, man, this is something different from what I was expecting, and I'd love to hear more. And then you'd come to a place like Gilman to experience that. But see, there's a difference between listening to music and being in an environment. This was an intimidating environment to be in. There was definitely a grittiness to this that meant that when you were hearing those songs, it was impacting you in a way that you wouldn't get just listening to it on cassette. That's a big part of what made the punk rock scene so raw and so compelling, because at that age, kids that are first establishing their independence from their parents, ages 13, 14, 15, oftentimes parents are dictating what's permissible, what's not permissible. If it's not parents, it's teachers. If it's not teachers, it's guidance counselors. There's someone that's curating a lot of things in your life. But then when you step into an environment like this, all those rules go out the window. Nothing is being curated anymore. There's no filters on anything. Not in terms of what you're hearing, not in terms of what you're smelling, you're feeling, not in terms of the perceived danger to yourself when you're in the slam pit, for example. Establishing that sense of, I can stand on my own 2 feet, I can make it through this night, and I can come through having learned something, is definitely a point of pride. And punk rock really spoke to that life transition that happens. When I was 14 years old, I was a skateboard messenger in San Francisco. And the company that I worked for, the receptionists, they were in a punk rock band called Papa Wheelie. And their boyfriends were bike messengers. These were older guys that would take important documents around town, and that was their day jobs. At night, we would gather and you would have essentially a garage band environment. People would play in the garage bands. This is where they would rehearse, they would practice, they would get ready for shows. And that was a lot of fun. It was fun for me as an early teen to see sort of a model of what would be possible later. That's where kids like me could come to a place like Gilman Street where it really was premised around youth participation. One of the interesting things about Gilman and the bands that played here is that the lyrics were very socially conscious for a lot of these bands. It's very much in the moment. And the things that were happening, that they were observing, that they were relaying and communicating to the audience didn't end when the show ended. So the intent was, we are going to flag something that's happening in our community or that's happening here that you need to be aware of. And there is an expectation that we collectively act on that. So when you think about Gilman, not just as a concert venue, but as a gathering place where people could mobilize around causes that were important to them, or values that they thought were being trampled or overlooked in society at large, there was very much an expectation that what you're hearing on stage influences what then happens, maybe during the week before the next show. And so the next show that you attend, maybe things have changed since the last show that you were here when you first heard of an issue flagged. And I think that's something that is certainly not commonplace in any musical genre, but punk really does get credit for that mobilization of energy outside of the venue to actually have, hopefully, a positive societal impact, oftentimes in raising awareness, but even extending beyond that to actually make a difference. Because you didn't have traditional big name record labels and promoters that were the masterminds of who made it big, who didn't, who got to play, who didn't. Because this was a grassroots movement, that meant that all of the accoutrements that go along with the music scene also had to be improvised. So t-shirts were not outsourced from a business that does t-shirts. T-shirts were silk screened by people that needed to learn how to silk screen a shirt. The designs that went on those shirts didn't come from design firms. They were scribbled almost like you would do on a school desk. And those were the graphic art skills that allowed for the printing of those shirts. The same with the album covers, the same with the flyers. That whole vibe of what it meant to produce the promotional materials, the swag, and the music itself, those were skills that people learned and through doing it themselves and through improvisation. And I think that there's something really refreshing and empowering about that. And later, as young adults, develop life skills that in many cases allowed them to pivot into careers that many of them are still in this day. Whether that's in graphic design, whether that's in media production, a lot of these hard skills were in their infancy around scenes like what took place at Gilman Street. When most people think about Berkeley, they think about the counterculture movement of the 1960s. This really was very much ground zero for flower power and the hippie movement, the pushback against the Vietnam War. All of that happened here. It might seem a little bit odd that in the years that follow, this also became ground zero for punk rock, at least here on the West Coast. Part of the explanation for that is that same freedom of thinking and that same freedom of expression that allowed students at the Berkeley campus to protest against Vietnam or against corporate America, those same parents raised kids to themselves be free thinkers and to themselves feel empowered to express themselves. Now, they wanted to do it in a very different way than their parents did. This wasn't Woodstock after all. And the way that corporate America was defining what their identity should be through MTV was not going to fly here because the bands that played here, the scene that was emerging wasn't MTV friendly. It was modeled to be outside of all of that. And that sense of being an outsider is very much in line with the Berkeley ethos. There's power in unity, there's power in the collective, even if it's channeled through something that feels 180 degrees from the hippie movement that came before. The underpinnings, that sense of youth first, learning as we go, getting good at something, mastering a craft, that's very much a part of the punk scene. The 1960s was very much a youth movement. The idea of counterculture was very much a pushback against established industry and established norms. That message, that way of thinking got lost with the advent of the disco era and everything that happened basically for the majority of the 1970s, up until punk rock hit at the very end of the 70s. That's when we saw things flip on their head again. So we went from a bottoms-up approach in the 60s to in the 1980s, where we had a top-down approach where labels and executives were dictating what music got produced, who it was sold to, what were the minimums for it to be deemed successful or commercially viable. There needed to be a way of moving away from that. And punk rock really did represent a firm pivot to what had come before, which was, again, a bottoms-up revolt. It was this notion that we don't need to necessarily have our taste dictated to us. This can come from ourselves. And it's something that can be happening in real time. It's not something that you map out necessarily on a calendar or saying that 6 months or 8 months from now, this is where everyone's going to be. It's going to be happening organically and it's going to happen in real time. Now, during this time, there were a number of upcoming bands that actually, when I was in high school, I used to come here and see, along with my cameraman, Jason, who's helping to film this. Operation Ivy was one of the famous ones. They had their breakup show here that I was in attendance for. For those that know the band Rancid, that was sort of the early version of what Rancid ultimately became. There was a band called the Mr. T Experience that recorded a song called 924 Gilman Street about this exact venue. Even Jello Biafra, the lead singer of the Dead Kennedys, had come here on occasion and actually was injured at one of the shows. So a number of people have come through this place over the years, and as its reputation grew and as its popularity began to bloom, this became known as a destination. This was a place that even touring bands that were maybe for the first time out on the road would come and play. One other actually famous one was Green Day, which used to be called Sweet Children back in the day. They also got their start here. And of course, these bands that maybe cut their teeth in a venue like this would then go on to play much bigger venues all over the world in some cases. On a personal note, I'd mentioned being here for Operation Ivy's breakup show. This was the last formal concert that they played before Jesse Michaels, their lead singer, went off to college. And this place was packed to the gills. It was absolutely nuts. You could barely move. And in fact, they had to stop the show several times because although there is this understood obligation to pick people up when they fall down, it was literally so crowded that night that people were getting trampled and no one was aware. To my knowledge, there were a number of injuries that night. I believe someone may have had their arm broken. Now, these are growing pains that really could happen at any venue. It's not something that's unique to Gilman Street. But as a result of experiences like that, the rules and adherence to occupancy requirements definitely were things that had to get ironed out. And I'm happy to report were ironed out. And in fact, because of improvements made to the venue, they can now host larger numbers of people safely and still make sure that people aren't getting hurt, that the emergency exits are operable, and everything else is up to code and being handled appropriately. One of the big distinctions when you have a collective scene, sort of this bottom-up approach, is that when you take money out of the equation, it really elevates the entire experience for everyone. For the band, because they can play music that's true to them. It's true to their values, and for the audience, because they're seeing something raw and they're seeing something that's relatable in a way that being sold to, quite frankly, isn't. So for example, when you came to a show at Gilman Street, you really didn't know what you were going to get. It could be the worst band you ever saw, it could be the greatest show that you ever saw. Because this was sort of a sacred space, it was sort of a safe place, it was a place where you could really cut loose, you could try out things. You didn't have to be polished. In fact, there was no expectation of being particularly polished. But if you were, and if you knew what you were doing, the accolades were huge. To this day, this is actually still an active punk rock club and collective. The rates are very inexpensive for kids to come see shows. They can volunteer their time, they can help plan the events, they can help clean, they can help sell drinks and t-shirts. There's lots of ways that they can both engage with the venue and also develop life skills and social skills. And it makes sense that that would happen in the Bay Area. The Bay Area has always been about reinventing yourself. It's always been a place, going back to the gold mine days, about leaving everything behind, starting from scratch, pioneering something new. We saw that with tech, we saw that with the gay rights movement, which also had its start here. A lot of things, a lot of traditional values that were challenged in the Bay Area were challenged here because people were willing to kind of wash their hands of something and move on to something that, what's next? What's going to come from me that's authentic to me? And I feel like places like Gilman allowed a safe place and a safe environment for that to happen. Now, if you like this story and you want to hear more like it, be sure to like and subscribe. Maybe drop a comment if you've been to one of the shows here at Gilman Street or have seen one of the bands that first emerged from this West Coast scene. We'd love to hear about it, and we'll look forward to seeing you on new episodes of the Ground Floor Innovation Channel. Thanks for joining us.